Windsor Castle. It looms over the Thames not as a palace, but as a warning carved from chalk and stone. For nearly 1,000 years, it has been the ultimate symbol of the British monarchy, enduring, majestic, and above all, unquestionable. But this carefully polished image is a lie, or more accurately, it is a brilliantly constructed half-truth, designed to conceal a foundation far darker than its deepest dungeon. The official history begins with a conqueror choosing a hill in 1066. But William didn't just choose this place, he weaponized it. He built a Norman scar directly upon the landscape of Saxon power, a deliberate act of political and cultural erasure. This was never intended as a home. It was an instrument of occupation, a raw timber fortress designed to terrorize a newly subjugated population into silence. So why was that brutalist earth and timber fort so obsessively encased in cold, impenetrable stone within just a few generations? What persistent, gnawing fear drove a new dynasty to build walls so thick they could defy not just a rebel army, but the very judgment of time itself? They tell us it was for prestige, a symbol of permanence, but prestige doesn't explain the grim engineering of its dungeons, or the calculated placement of every arrow slit. And why do the glossy guidebooks celebrate the romance of royal hunts, but censor the brutal reality of the forest laws that made them possible? These were not regulations, they were a legal framework for terror. Vast territories were declared the king's private hunting grounds, where a starving peasant could lose their hands, their eyes, or their life for the crime of killing a deer to feed their family. The castle controlled not just the river, but life and death for leagues in every direction. Why has the grand myth of King Arthur's Round Table, which Edward III tried to resurrect here, been allowed to overshadow the true, chilling stories of those imprisoned within these very walls? We hear of chivalry, but not of the noblewoman and her son starved to death in the dark on the orders of a paranoid king. Their ghosts don't feature on the official tour. Their inconvenient history was simply erased. We are therefore left with a disturbing pattern of unsettling questions. Questions about strategic location, about paranoid architecture, about the weaponization of law, and about the systematic curation of memory. Each answer pulls back another layer of gilded myth, revealing not a story of glorious, unbroken continuity, but a violent, 1,000-year history of suppression, conflict, and deliberate, calculated forgetting. What if the primary function of Windsor Castle for a millennium was never to protect the monarchy from its enemies, but to bury the evidence of how that power was truly forged and brutally maintained? What was built on that hill was never a home, it was a declaration of war. The story of Windsor Castle, as it is told, is a masterpiece of historical branding. A seamless narrative of 950 years of unbroken royal succession, beginning with a victorious William the Conqueror in 1066. We are shown a fortress that gracefully evolved into a palace, a stoic witness to English history, the very heart of the monarchy. But this elegant narrative has a fatal flaw. It begins in the wrong place. The true seat of royal power in this region was not on that imposing chalk hill. It was 2 miles downriver at what is now known as Old Windsor. This was the site of a significant Saxon royal palace, a center of administration and authority long before the first Norman ship touched the English coast. The Normans knew this. The choice to build their new fortress on a different, unblemished hill was not an accident of geography or a simple military preference. It was a calculated act of political and psychological dominance. It was a clear and brutal message to the defeated Saxons. Your power center is now irrelevant. Your history is over. Ours begins here, looking down upon you. This was not a relocation. It was a conquest of memory. By physically moving the center of power, William the Conqueror did more than build a garrison. He created a new reality on the landscape. From its very first timber, the new Windsor was designed not to continue a legacy, but to bury one. It was a Norman scar placed directly over the heart of Saxon influence. This act of burying the past is a pattern, one that extends from the soil beneath the castle to the secrets sealed within its stone walls. The grand facade of chivalry and royal splendor conceals a far more vicious reality. To understand the true function of Windsor, we must look past the tapestries and state dinners and into the darkness. We must consider the case of Maud de Braose. Her name is not one you will find prominently displayed in the state apartments, yet her story is more revealing than any royal portrait. In the early 13th century, Maud was the wife of William de Braose, one of the most powerful barons in the realm, and a one-time favorite of King John. But the favor of a paranoid king is a fragile thing. A dispute over loyalty and money escalated into open defiance. King John, a monarch defined by insecurity and brutal retribution, saw Maud's outspoken challenge not as a political disagreement, but as a personal affront that required a lesson in absolute power. He hunted her family relentlessly. While her husband escaped, Maud and her eldest son William were captured and, according to the most chilling accounts, imprisoned within the walls of Windsor Castle. Their sentence was not a swift execution by the axe, a fate considered honorable for the nobility. It was a slow, calculated descent into nothingness, death by starvation. The historical record is grimly debated. Some chroniclers place their final agony at Corfe Castle, but the location is almost secondary. The act itself reveals the castle's true purpose. It was a tool of terror. Whether she drew her last breath at Windsor or Corfe, her fate became an inescapable message sent to every noble family in the kingdom. It demonstrated that the stone walls of the king's castles were not just for defense against foreign enemies. They were instruments for enforcing loyalty at home. They were cages, capable of inflicting a fate far crueler than a quick death on a battlefield. This forgotten atrocity and the deliberate erasure of the Saxon palace at Old Windsor are not separate stories. They are the same story, told centuries apart. They reveal that Windsor Castle was founded on an act of suppression and sanctified by an act of brutality. Its purpose was never merely to exist, but to dominate. This forces us to re-examine the very ground on which the castle stands. The official story credits its placement to military genius. But if the first act was to erase a rival power center, what other strategic calculations, hidden in plain sight, were disguised as simple geography? The simple answer, the one offered by military historians, is that the location was chosen for its textbook perfection. And it was. But to see it only as a military calculation is to miss the true, lethal genius of the decision. Geography is never neutral. It is the first and most powerful weapon in any conqueror's arsenal, and William wielded it with brutal precision. The most obvious feature is the hill itself, a steep, lonely chalk bluff rising abruptly from the surrounding flatlands. It is a natural fortress, a geological gift that saved the Normans thousands of man-hours in earthworks. From this vantage point, the world unfolds like a map, but the true prize was not the view of the land. It was the command of the water, the River Thames. In the 11th century, this was not a picturesque waterway for pleasure craft. It was the primary economic and military artery of southern England. It was the highway that fed London, that carried its trade, its armies, its information. To control the Thames was to hold a blade to the throat of the capital. From their new perch, Norman sentries could monitor every vessel moving up or down river for miles. No supply convoy, no Saxon raiding party, No messenger could pass unseen. Windsor was the lock on London's main gate. Then there was the land. The castle was positioned precisely 1 day's march from the Tower of London. This was no coincidence. It was the crucial interval for a medieval army. It meant that a garrison at Windsor could react to a threat against the capital within 24 hours. Conversely, the king could leave the city and be in a secure fortress by nightfall. It acted as both a tripwire and a forward operating base, perfectly positioned to intercept any rebellion moving towards London from the west. But Windsor was never a solitary sentinel. It was a key node in a vast, terrifying network of suppression. William was building a ring of castles around London, the Tower to the east, Hertford and Berkhamsted to the north, and Windsor to the west. This was not a defensive wall to keep foreign invaders out. It was a cage designed to keep the newly conquered English in. It was an architectural system of martial law, an interlocking grid of fortresses from which Norman power could be projected to crush any Saxon uprising before it could gather momentum. And finally, there was the element of psychological warfare disguised as leisure. The castle was built on the very edge of a vast Saxon royal forest. For the Anglo-Saxon kings, this had been a prized hunting ground, a place of sport and ritual. For the Normans, the hunt was something more. It was a theatrical performance of power, a display of martial skill and aristocratic dominance. By seizing this land, William appropriated a potent symbol of Saxon sovereignty. He was not just building a military base, he was taking over their sacred spaces, hunting their game, and imposing his own brutal forest laws upon their people. Every time the king and his court rode out from the castle to hunt, it was a visceral reminder to the local populace of who was now master. The castle, therefore, did not just control the flow of trade and troops. It controlled the very symbols of life and status. The site of Windsor was a nexus of control, military, economic, and symbolic. It was a masterpiece of strategic thinking, chosen not only to defend a conquest, but to systematically dismantle the identity of the conquered. The geography did not just allow for a fortress, it demanded one. And so, the question becomes not why it was placed there, but what internal anxieties and colossal ambitions demanded that it take such an impenetrable, enduring form. A fortress is built from fear. William's original Windsor was a raw expression of a conqueror's anxiety, a crude earth and timber stockade, hastily erected to control a hostile population. It was a functional, ugly piece of military hardware. Its purpose was not to inspire, but to intimidate. It projected only one message: obedience or death. But fear is a temporary fuel for a dynasty. A regime built solely on terror is brittle. The sons and grandsons of the conquerors face a different problem. Their challenge is not to seize power, but to legitimize it. They must transform the cold reality of invasion into the accepted order of the nation. They must turn the instrument of occupation into a symbol of permanence. This is the central secret of Windsor, its transformation from a weapon into a throne. The first crucial shift came with William's son, Henry III. By 1110, the immediate shock of the conquest had passed, but the realm was far from stable. Henry needed to demonstrate that Norman rule was not a permanent military campaign, but a functioning government. And so he did something radical. He chose to live at Windsor. By holding his Pentecost court within its walls, he made a profound political statement. He was declaring that the fortress was now safe enough to be a home. He was inviting the nobility not to a war council, but to a state occasion. This was the first deliberate act of domesticating the fortress. It was the moment the cold stone of military necessity began to be overlaid with the architecture of political theatre. The castle was no longer just a garrison. It was becoming a stage for the performance of kingship. 2 centuries later, this transformation reached its zenith under a king who was not a conqueror, but a native son. Edward III was born at Windsor. For him, it was not a strategic asset, it was his birthright. And he had an ambition far grander than mere stability. He sought to create a new English Camelot with himself as its Arthur. In the midst of the brutal 100 Years' War with France, Edward needed a powerful ideology to bind his fractious knights to his cause. He reached back into the mists of British mythology and pulled forth the legend of the Round Table, a symbol of chivalric unity and divine purpose, and he decided that Windsor would be its new home. In 1348, he founded the Order of the Garter, the most prestigious chivalric order in English history. This was not merely an honorific society, it was the enactment of a national myth. Windsor was to be its physical heart, a place where the greatest knights of the realm would gather in a fellowship of arms. The grim fortress had to be reborn as a palace of chivalry. For centuries, this was understood as a symbolic ambition, but the true, breathtaking scale of Edward's vision remained buried, a secret kept by the earth itself. Then, in 2006, archaeologists excavating in the Upper Ward made a staggering discovery. They unearthed the foundations of an immense circular building, 200 feet in diameter. This was no mere feasting hall. This was the physical footprint of Edward's Round Table, a monumental structure intended to give architectural form to a national legend. The project was ultimately abandoned, perhaps a victim of the Black Death or the immense cost of the war, but its ghost remains in the ground. The foundation is the hard evidence of a monarch's attempt to weaponize mythology, to transform a castle of conquest into a cathedral of chivalry. The discovery proves that the evolution of Windsor was not a gentle, organic process. It was driven by the specific, often grandiose ambitions of the monarchs who inhabited it. They were not just maintaining a building, they were reshaping it to project a new idea of power. The motivation was no longer the conqueror's fear of the Saxon peasant, it was the king's desire to cast a legendary shadow across the whole of Christendom. The castle's exterior, therefore, had to become a new kind of message to the world. That new message to the world was not written in ink, but carved in stone, layer upon brutal layer, each one telling a different, more sophisticated lie. The architecture of Windsor is a physical record of the monarchy's evolving propaganda, a masterclass in how to turn a threat into a fairy tale. It began as an open wound on the landscape. William's first castle was a crude motte and bailey, a hastily thrown-up mound of earth topped with a splintered wooden tower, all encircled by a rough palisade. Its design was brutally honest. It was cheap, fast, and effective. It was not meant to be beautiful, it was meant to be seen. Its message was simple and visceral. We are here, we can kill you from above, do not resist. It was the architecture of occupation, temporary, aggressive, and utterly without pretense. But a dynasty cannot live in a temporary threat. Wood rots, it burns, it speaks of impermanence. For the next generation, under Henry II, the message had to change. The dynasty needed to project stability, to claim that their rule was not an ongoing military crisis, but a permanent, natural state. So the wood was ripped down and replaced with stone. This was not a simple upgrade. It was a fundamental shift in communication. The construction of the first stone round tower and the massive curtain walls was a declaration of permanence. Stone does not rot. It suggests an institution as enduring as the geology of the land itself. It was a message to the restive barons and the subjugated populace that the Norman regime was no longer a temporary fixture, it was forever. This wasn't construction, it was a rebranding campaign in masonry. Centuries later, Edward III added another layer of meaning. The castle he inherited was a grim, powerful stone fortress. But his ambition was not merely to be powerful, it was to be legendary. To house his new Camelot, the Order of the Garter, the stark military functionality of the fortress was insufficient. It needed to speak of chivalry, of a glorious, mythical past. And so Windsor was cloaked in the language of the Gothic. The severe Norman structures were refaced and expanded with the soaring arches, vaulted ceilings, and grander windows of a new, more confident age. This architectural choice was a deliberate act of historical association. It was an attempt to link his court, through style, to an imagined golden age of heroes. The castle was no longer just a fortress. It was a stage set for a national epic. The final and most deceptive transformation came in the 1820s. In an age of revolution, the monarchy under George IV needed a new image. The architect Geoffrey Wyatville was hired not just to restore the castle, but to reinvent it. He was a showman, and his greatest trick was performed on the Round Tower. He more than doubled its height, adding a hollow crown to the top. This was a purely cosmetic act. It served no military purpose. Its only function was to create a dramatic, romantic silhouette that could be seen for miles, an instantly recognizable symbol of majestic power. Wyatville wasn't restoring a medieval fortress. He was designing a logo. He sanitized the castle's brutal history, turning a weapon of conquest into a picturesque fantasy. The iconic image of Windsor we know today is this final, brilliant piece of propaganda. The silhouette they created was a masterpiece of public relations, a carefully constructed mask designed for the outside world. But if the exterior was a message, the interior was the machine. A floor plan hidden from public view is a true diagram of power. A floor plan hidden from public view is a true diagram of power. To read Windsor correctly, you must turn your back on its grand, theatrical silhouette and pass through its gates, not as a tourist, but as a courtier desperate for access, or a petitioner begging for justice. The castle's interior is not a home. It is a brutal and brilliant machine for social sorting. From its earliest days, the castle was trisected. The lower, middle, and upper wards were not simply geographic descriptors. They were concentric rings of exclusion, a physical filter for the kingdom's power structure. A common merchant might gain entry to the lower ward on business. A minor knight might be granted access to the middle ward. But the upper ward, the highest ground, the most secure, the closest to God and the king, that was a sanctum. Your social rank determined which wall you were permitted to pass. The architecture was a constant, silent reminder of your precise place in the world. It was Henry II who first formalized this separation into a governing principle. He established the public royal apartments in the lower ward. This was the interface of the state, the place for tedious administrative work, for hearing legal cases, for the messy business of running a kingdom. But his private apartments were established far away, in the secluded and heavily guarded upper ward. This was the masterstroke. It was the separation of the business of monarchy from the sanctity of the monarch. By creating this distance, he made himself less accessible and therefore more powerful. To see the king in his private quarters was the ultimate prize, a sign of immense favor. The floor plan was engineered to create a mystique, transforming the man from a mere administrator into a semi-divine figure, set apart from the common world. For centuries, the true antiquity of this design was buried under layers of renovation and redecoration. But then came the fire of 1992. That catastrophe became an act of violent archaeology. As the flames tore through the state apartments, they stripped away the gilded ceilings and priceless tapestries, exposing the ancient bones of the castle. In the ashes, archaeologists found the proof they were looking for. They uncovered the stone foundations of the original king's houses built by Henry I around 1110. This was the clue. It proved that the concept of a segregated, privileged royal space was not a later innovation, but part of the Norman strategy from the very beginning. Even before the fortress was fully stone, its internal logic was already being designed to isolate and elevate the king. This logic reached its ultimate conclusion under Edward III. As he transformed the exterior into a Gothic fantasy, he perfected the interior into a self-contained social ecosystem. He built lavish, entirely separate suites of rooms for himself and for the Queen. This was not a domestic arrangement, it was a political one. The King's Court and the Queen's Court were distinct centers of power and patronage, and the architecture gave them their own separate spheres. Even more importantly, permanent residences for the court's most important members were built directly into the upper ward. The inner circle no longer just visited the king, they lived with him, trapped in a cage of privilege and paranoia. Their lives were entirely circumscribed by the castle's rules, their loyalty ensured by constant proximity and surveillance. The upper ward became a machine for living, a mechanism where every corridor, every guarded doorway, and every private chamber reinforced the rigid hierarchy of power. This intricate machine for controlling people was not contained by its own walls. Its ultimate purpose was to project that control outwards, to domesticate not just the court, but the wilderness itself. To domesticate the wilderness was the final act of a perfect conquest. The true reach of Windsor's power was never defined by the range of a crossbow fired from its battlements. Its real walls were invisible, stretching for miles across the countryside, and they were forged not from stone, but from a terrifying new legal code. The Normans brought a new concept to England, the royal forest. The word itself is a masterpiece of deception. To a Saxon, a forest was a place of trees. To a Norman, a forest was a legal definition. It was any tract of land, woodland, farmland, even entire villages, that was declared subject to a separate and brutal set of laws, all for the sole purpose of preserving the king's hunt. This was the forest law. Its principles were chillingly simple. The life of a deer was worth more than the life of a man. It existed to protect two things: the venison, meaning the game animals reserved for the king, and the ver, the green undergrowth that sustained them. Everything else, including the survival of the people who lived there, was secondary. The prohibitions were absolute, designed to cripple a rural economy and break the will of the local populace. You could not fence your own fields to protect your crops from the king's deer. You could not carry a bow, effectively disarming the English peasantry. You could not clear new land for farming. You could not even gather fallen branches for your own fire. The cruelty was meticulous. Any dog large enough to threaten a deer had to be lawed, a sanitized term for a horrific act of mutilation. 3 claws were hacked off one of the animal's front paws, crippling it, ensuring it could never run fast enough to hunt. This was the law, enforced by the king's foresters, who acted as a secret police force in the countryside with the power to punish, maim, and kill. The scale of this legal land grab is difficult to comprehend. At its height, nearly a third of southern England was designated royal forest. Entire counties like Essex fell under its jurisdiction. Windsor Castle was not just a fortress on a hill, it was the administrative headquarters for a vast private hunting preserve, a fiefdom of fear where the king's pleasure was the only law that mattered. This was total environmental control. It transformed the natural landscape into an extension of the king's private domain, a place where the English were no longer citizens, but trespassers on their own land. With the outside world thus subjugated, life within the castle walls could be perfected into its own intricate, ritualized performance. That ritualized performance, perfected within the castle's controlled environment, reached its zenith under Edward III. The king, a master of political theatre, understood that power was not just held, it had to be seen. It required a script, costumes, and a grand stage. The play he wrote was The Order of the Garter, and Windsor Castle was its permanent, magnificent theatre. This was not an act of peacetime pageantry. It was forged in the crucible of war. By 1348, Edward was deep into the brutal, generation-spanning conflict with France that would become the 100 Years' War. He needed a mechanism to bind the most dangerous and ambitious men in his kingdom directly to his own person, a bond stronger than feudal obligation. The Garter was that mechanism. The annual Garter Day ceremony at St. George's Chapel became the gravitational center of the court's calendar. Imagine the procession. 26 knights, the most feared warriors in Europe, clad not in steel, but in deep blue velvet mantles embroidered with gold. Their plumed hats, the very symbol of chivalric romance, moving in solemn procession to the chapel. This was a calculated display of domesticated violence, a spectacle that transformed brutal warlords into members of a sacred, exclusive club. Membership was the ultimate prize. It bred a fierce, competitive loyalty. To be excluded was a public humiliation. The order created a closed circle, a privileged elite who shared secrets, rituals, and a direct line to the king. It turned potential rivals into sworn brothers, their ambitions channeled not against the throne, but in service to it and to each other. It was, in effect, a magnificently costumed conspiracy with the king at its center. But this performance, this grand theater of loyalty, was fantastically expensive. The robes, the jewels, the lavish feasts, the constant maintenance of the chapel, it all had to be paid for. The glamour of chivalry was underwritten by a far less romantic reality. For every yard of velvet in the procession, there was a tax levied, a rent collected, a duty imposed. The power celebrated within the castle walls was fueled by a vast, efficient, and often brutal economic engine that operated far beyond them. That economic engine was not a machine of gears and steam. It was a machine of paper, law, and fear, and it was the most perfect instrument of extraction ever devised in medieval Europe. The beauty of Windsor, the velvet of the Garter ceremony, the very stones in its walls, all were paid for by a revolution in finance that began with a single, brutal legal fiction. The moment William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings, he declared that every inch of English soil, every field, every river, every village was now his personal property. This was not a political maneuver. It was the greatest single act of organized theft in English history. By right of conquest, the entire nation was confiscated. The Anglo-Saxon system of land ownership was not reformed, it was annihilated. What followed was a ruthless corporate restructuring. William dispossessed over 4,000 Anglo-Saxon thanes, the local lords and landowners who formed the backbone of the Old Kingdom. He replaced them with a new ruling class of less than 200 of his own Norman barons. These men were not granted land in the old sense. They were tenants-in-chief, regional managers whose job was to hold the land on the king's behalf and squeeze it for every drop of value. But how do you tax a nation you've just stolen? How do you know what it's truly worth? In 1085, William commissioned the answer, a national audit of unprecedented, terrifying thoroughness. It was a survey so meticulous, so invasive, and so final that the English populace gave it a name that invoked the end of the world, the Domesday Book. This was not a census. It was a brutal accounting. Royal commissioners swept through every shire, every hundred, every village, putting priests, reeves and local villagers under oath. The questions were relentless. Who held this land before the conquest? Who holds it now? How many hides? How many ploughs in domain? How many mills and fisheries? How many freemen, villagers and slaves? What was it worth then? What is it worth now? There was no appeal. The book's judgment was as inescapable as God's. For the first time, a European king had a detailed ledger of his entire kingdom's economic output. He knew exactly who owned what, where they were, and how much he could demand from them. This book became the engine of the Norman state, allowing for the most efficient and ruthless system of taxation in the known world. The funds for Windsor were extracted through this machine. The primary tax was the geld, a national land tax that now flowed with unparalleled efficiency into the king's coffers. Feudal duties demanded that the new barons pay for the privilege of holding their land, money that financed the king's ambitions. And at the bottom of the pyramid were the conquered English, whose labor could be commandeered, whose harvests could be taxed, and whose wealth was systematically siphoned upwards. Every stone hauled to the top of Windsor's hill was paid for by this system. Every mason's wage, every barrel of lime, every nail forged in a blacksmith's fire was underwritten by the dispossession of an entire people. The castle's grandeur is not a monument to English heritage. It is a monument to the terrifying efficiency of the Norman extraction machine. This system was so total, so seemingly perfect, that it appears indestructible. And yet, this brutal economic truth has been almost completely overshadowed by a more romantic narrative of kings and chivalry. A story this fundamental does not simply fade away by accident. It must be eclipsed by a conflict so profound that it threatens to tear the entire structure down. That machine was designed to be unbreakable, but its architects made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed the men who operated it would remain forever loyal to the man who owned it. The Norman system was a pyramid of power, but it depended on the consent of the powerful barons just below the king. What happens when the king pushes that system so far that the pyramid inverts and the full weight of the machine turns against its master? The answer is the First Barons' War, and its epicenter was Windsor Castle. The story, we are told, of the monarchy is one of majesty challenged, but ultimately prevailing. It is a narrative of continuity. But this narrative is a carefully edited film from which the most terrifying scene has been deliberately removed. This is that scene. The conflict that should define Windsor's history is the one that has been most successfully obscured, because it proves that the castle and the monarchy itself was never invincible. It was, for a few desperate months, on the verge of utter collapse. The catalyst was King John. He was a king who inherited the tools of a conqueror but lacked the conqueror's authority. He treated the Domesday machine not as a tool for governance, but as a personal instrument of extortion. The relentless taxation and feudal demands were no longer just levied against the conquered English. John turned the full, crushing force of the system against his own Norman barons. The ledger of national assets became his personal book of grudges. He demanded exorbitant fees, seized lands on flimsy pretexts, and took hostages from noble families to ensure their compliance. By 1215, the barons had had enough. In the water meadows of Runnymede, in the very shadow of Windsor Castle, they forced King John to sign a document, a great charter. We call it Magna Carta. Today, it is revered as the foundation of liberty. But in 1215, it was a desperate, last-ditch ultimatum. It was a list of demands from the shareholders of the English enterprise to a CEO who had gone rogue. And the moment the ink was dry, John, with the backing of the Pope, repudiated it. The treaty failed. The Civil War began. What happened next was unthinkable. The barons, seeing no hope of reforming their own king, committed the ultimate act of treason. They invited a foreign power to invade and seize the throne. They offered the crown of England to Prince Louis of France. This was not a rebellion. It was a hostile takeover, and it almost worked. Louis landed in England not as an enemy, but as a guest of the aristocracy. London threw open its gates to him. The kingdom fractured, with a majority of the barons siding with the French prince. King John was left with a handful of strategic castles, and the most important of them all was Windsor. It was the linchpin of his defense, the great stone symbol of the royal authority he still claimed to possess. For Louis to win, Windsor had to fall. In the summer of 1216, a tide of rebellion arrived at the castle's gates. A combined army of rebel English barons and French knights laid siege to the fortress. For 2 brutal months, the castle was pounded by war machines. Great trebuchets, built on site, hurled massive stones against the new walls that Henry II had built to last forever. Miners dug tunnels, attempting to collapse the outer defenses. This was the ultimate test. The system was now at war with itself. The descendants of the conquerors were using the techniques of conquest against the conqueror's heir. Inside, a small, fiercely loyalist garrison held on under the command of a fearsome and effective constable named Engelard de Cigogne. They were outnumbered, cut off, and facing the combined might of their own countrymen and a foreign army. Day after day, the siege ground on, a relentless assault on the stone and the morale of the defenders. Windsor held. Just, but it did not prevail through a glorious feat of arms. The siege was ultimately lifted because of an accident of biology. In October 1216, King John died of dysentery. With him died the primary cause of the war. The barons' loyalty to a foreign prince suddenly evaporated, and they gradually rallied to John's young son, Henry III. The castle survived, but it was battered, scarred, and severely damaged. The siege had proven a terrifying point. The king could be cornered. His greatest fortress could be brought to the brink of destruction not by a foreign enemy, but by his own people. This is why the story is eclipsed. A symbol of power cannot afford a history of such profound vulnerability. The official narrative celebrates Windsor the palace, Windsor the home of the Garter, Windsor the romantic icon. It cannot accommodate Windsor, the grim survivor of a catastrophic civil war that nearly ended the dynasty. The repairs that followed under Henry III were not just an act of restoration, they were an act of architectural forgetting, plastering over the deep scars of near failure. But scars, whether on stone or on the memory of a dynasty, have a cost. They are weaknesses that time, weather, and the cold, unforgiving arithmetic of maintenance will always find. That arithmetic is the final, inescapable truth of Windsor. Power is not a constant. It is a calculation of income against expenditure. Grandeur has a carrying cost, and time always presents a bill. The story of Windsor's near collapse in 1216 is not just a military drama, it is a financial one. The siege inflicted deep, structural wounds on the castle, and the repairs, begun by Henry III, were a vast and expensive undertaking that stretched on for years. This cycle of crisis, repair, and immense cost became the castle's secret rhythm. For all its appearance of timeless permanence, Windsor has spent much of its history teetering on the edge of decay. After the glories of Edward III's chivalric age, it entered a long, slow decline. By the 18th century, the great symbol of the monarchy was a neglected wreck. Roofs leaked, stonework crumbled, and entire sections were uninhabitable. It was a rotting tooth in the mouth of the nation, an embarrassment that required yet another colossal injection of capital under George III and George IV to restore its dignity. But the most brutal lesson in the arithmetic of decay came not from a medieval siege, but from a single misplaced spotlight. On November 20th, 1992, in the Queen's private chapel, a hot lamp was pressed too close to a curtain. It was a mundane, trivial accident, the kind that could happen in any home. But Windsor is not any home. The fire that ignited in that moment did not just burn a curtain, it found a feast. It roared through the ancient dry timber of the roof voids, the vast, unseen spaces between the gilded state ceilings and the lead-covered exterior. It became an unstoppable force, a ravenous beast consuming a millennium of history. For 15 hours, the fire raged. The world watched as the orange glow consumed St. George's Hall, the grand reception room, the very heart of the castle's state apartments. It was a visceral, horrifying spectacle. The roof of the Great Hall, a masterpiece of modern Gothic engineering, collapsed into a molten wreck. Priceless works of art, antique furniture, and centuries of irreplaceable craftsmanship were incinerated, reduced to ash and charcoal. When the last embers were extinguished, the true cost was revealed. 115 rooms, including 9 of the principal staterooms, were destroyed or severely damaged. An area of 9,000 square meters, 1/5 of the entire castle, was a blackened, waterlogged ruin. And then came the bill. The initial estimate for the restoration was $36.5 million. It was a staggering sum, and it ignited a fierce public debate. Who should pay? For centuries, the state had maintained the royal palaces, but in the modern era, the question of public funds being used to restore what was seen as the private home of a fantastically wealthy family became a political firestorm. The crisis forced a revolution in royal financing. In a deal struck with the government, it was decided that the public would pay for entry to Buckingham Palace for the first time in history, and the revenues would go towards the restoration. The Queen also agreed to pay income tax. It was a watershed moment. The fire had done what no rebellion had ever managed. It had forced a fundamental renegotiation of the financial contract between the monarch and the nation. The restoration itself was a monumental 5-year effort, a masterpiece of modern conservation. But it laid bare the ultimate vulnerability of such a place. Windsor is not just a building, it is a vast, complex, and fantastically expensive machine that is in a constant state of managed decay. It is a battle fought daily against gravity, damp, and the simple passage of time. The fire was not an isolated disaster, it was merely a catastrophic acceleration of an inevitable process. It reminds us that what has survived is fragile, and what has been lost is gone forever. What remains when the fires are out, the sieges are a distant echo, and the kings and queens are dust. You walk through Windsor today, and you believe you are seeing a complete, coherent thing, a castle. But you are not. You are walking on a ghost ship, a vessel rebuilt so many times that almost none of the original timbers remain. Its survival is an illusion, a curated collection of fragments, and its true afterlife is found not only in what stands, but in what is hidden. The first, most honest survivor is the ground beneath your feet, the motte. The great, conical hill upon which the round tower now sits is not entirely natural. It is the original act of Norman violence, a man-made mountain of earth, dug and piled by the forced labor of conquered Saxons. It is the primal scream of the conquest made physical. It has no architectural grace, no soaring beauty. It is a crude, brutal statement of dominance, the foundation upon which every subsequent layer of propaganda has been built. When you look at that hill, you are looking at the true, unvarnished beginning of the story. Then there are the bones, the oldest stones that still speak of their purpose. Walk the perimeter, and you can find them. Sections of the heavy curtain wall and the grim-faced towers built by Henry III, after the trauma of the 1216 siege. Look at the Curfew Tower, a stone sentinel dating to 1227. It is not romantic. Its arrow slits are narrow, paranoid eyes. Its function is pure military control. These stones are not part of a fairy tale palace. They are the architectural scar tissue of a near-fatal civil war. They are a stone suture holding the wound of the kingdom together. They survive as a testament to that moment of profound vulnerability, a truth that the later, more theatrical editions would try so desperately to conceal. Everything else, the soaring Gothic fantasy of Edward III, the romantic silhouette of Wyattville, the painstaking, perfect restoration after the 1992 fire, is a mask placed over this older, harsher face. The Windsor that exists today is a collage of conflicting intentions, a Norman war machine wrapped in a chivalric epic, all of it sanitized and repackaged for a modern audience. Its physical afterlife is a masterclass in historical editing, where the uncomfortable truths have been built over but never entirely erased. But if the stones are the castle's skeleton, where is its memory? Where is its consciousness? For that, we must look up to the very structure that the motte was built to support, the Round Tower. Today, it is not a military command center. It is something far more powerful and far more secret. It houses the Royal Archives. Established officially in 1912, the archives are the central nervous system of the Crown. This is not a public library. It is the official, curated memory of a 1,000-year-old institution. Within its climate-controlled strongrooms lie the paper ghosts of Windsor and the monarchy itself. The private letters of Queen Victoria, the secret political correspondence of George III, the household accounts that detail the precise cost of a king's coronation robes, the war diaries, the treaty negotiations, the intimate, unvarnished records of a dynasty. Here lie the receipts for the acts of power, the brutal arithmetic of rule, the whispers, scandals, and secrets that the official histories have smoothed over. This is the ultimate paradox of Windsor's survival. The archives represent one of the most significant acts of preservation in modern history, but they preserve history by locking it away. Access is not a right, it is a privilege granted sparingly after a long process of vetting and formal application. The doors of the Round Tower are more difficult to breach than any medieval gatehouse. The gatekeepers are not men in armor, but polite, scholarly archivists who are the custodians of a private, and therefore controllable, history. This secrecy is a source of profound controversy among historians. History, written from the outside, using only publicly available documents, will always be incomplete. The truth, in all its messy, inconvenient detail, lies in those boxes. What financial arrangements, what political compromises, what personal failings are documented on the brittle pages within? What would the unedited letters of monarchs reveal about the carefully constructed image of public duty? The royal archives are, therefore, the final and most sophisticated defense of the castle. They represent the transformation of power from physical force to the control of information. The most important treasures are no longer the crown jewels in the Tower of London, but the narrative itself, stored and guarded in the highest keep of Windsor. So what, then, is the true afterlife of this place? It is a profound and unsettling duality. We have the physical remains, the brutal honesty of the Norman earthwork, the grim functionality of the siege-era towers, all masked by the later, more palatable fantasies in stone. And we have the paper remains, a near-complete record of the monarchy's inner life, preserved with meticulous care, but deliberately held back from public view. The castle has survived, yes, but its survival is not a simple story of endurance. It is a story of calculated curation, of strategic concealment, and of the enduring power of a locked room. The final lesson of Windsor is not found in the grandeur of St. George's Hall. It is found in the silence that emanates from the archives. It is a lesson about what we are allowed to remember and what we are not. And it forces us to ask one final, critical question. That final, critical question is not about the past. It is about the present. It is the question that all power, in all its forms, fears the most. Who gets to tell the story? For 1,000 years, the stones of Windsor have been shaped and reshaped to give only one answer. But the evidence of our investigation demands another. The lesson of Windsor Castle is not a comforting story of endurance. It is a brutal, practical, and deeply relevant manual on the true nature of power, its inherent fragility, and the relentless cost of its survival. The first and most profound lesson is this: power is not a noun, it is a verb. We look at Windsor and see a static object, a fortress, a symbol. We are meant to see it as a thing that is. But its entire history proves that power is a thing that you do. It is a constant, frantic, and ruinously expensive act of becoming. Its longevity is not the product of inherent strength, but of a desperate, unbroken chain of adaptation, rebranding, and ruthless self-correction. Windsor survived not because it was invincible, but because its masters were willing to change its story, its form, and its function whenever reality threatened to tear it down. It was a military outpost when it needed to terrorize, a chivalric theater when it needed to inspire, a romantic fantasy when it needed to charm, and a tourist attraction when it needed to pay for its own repairs. Its only core principle is the principle of survival. This is a terrifying and vital lesson for us now, as we stand before the seemingly monolithic castles of modern institutions, corporations, governments, ideologies that project an identical illusion of permanence. They are not permanent, they are performing every single day. The second lesson is that this performance is built on a foundation of strategic forgetting. The power of Windsor was established not only by what William built, but by what he chose to erase, the Saxon seat of power at Old Windsor. The story began with an act of cultural demolition. This is the oldest trick in the Book of Power. To build your own legend, you must first burn the library of your predecessor. We see this today in every political campaign that rewrites the history of its opponent, in every corporate merger that swallows the identity of a smaller company, in every revolution that smashes the statues of the old regime. We are taught to look at what is built, but the real story is often in the empty spaces, the silences, the things that are deliberately no longer there. The true investigator learns to listen for the echoes in the void. The third lesson is that beauty is a weapon, and its cost is always paid by someone else. We are seduced by the Gothic splendor, the chivalric romance, the sheer theatricality of the castle. But our investigation has shown that this beauty is the gilded lid on a brutal machine of extraction. The Domesday Book, the forest laws, the crushing taxation, this was the dirty engine that powered the fantasy. Every stone in Windsor is mortared with the dispossession of the Anglo-Saxon people. This truth is a universal solvent that can be applied to any grand project. When we admire a gleaming skyscraper, we must ask about the land it was built on and the labor that raised it. When we celebrate a technological marvel, we must investigate the human and environmental cost of the resources it consumes. The lesson of Windsor is to always ask for the receipt. Power writes the poetry, but the price is always recorded in the prose of a ledger, and that ledger is almost always hidden. This brings us to the final and most urgent lesson. The ultimate battlefield is the archive. The near destruction of Windsor during the Barons' War revealed its physical vulnerability, but its true survival into the modern age is guaranteed by a far more sophisticated defense, the control of its own narrative, locked within the Round Tower. Power in the 21st century is no longer solely about stone walls and armies. It is about the control of information. The most powerful institutions are those who can curate their own history, who can grant or deny access to the truth, who can decide which stories are told and which remain buried in a climate-controlled vault. The secrecy of the royal archives is not an anomaly. It is the model. Every major corporation has its own archive of internal memos. Every government has its classified documents. Every political party has its opposition research. They understand that the person who controls the past controls the present. So, why does this 1,000-year-old story matter now? It matters because we are all living within the walls of castles we cannot see. We are subject to grand narratives designed to make power seem natural, inevitable, and permanent. The lesson of Windsor is a call to become our own investigators. It is a blueprint for critical thinking. It teaches us to question the facade, to look for the scars of conflict, to calculate the hidden costs, and to demand access to the archives. It proves that history is not a settled story to be passively consumed. It is a live investigation, and the stakes are the truth itself. For those of you who wish to take up this work, the tools are there. The key to the unwritten chapters of Windsor lies, as we've seen, in the royal archives. Be warned, the path is not easy. The application process is a modern reflection of the castle's ancient gates, designed to test and vet those who seek entry. It requires patience, academic rigor, and a clear purpose. It can take months, even years. This very process is a lesson in how tightly information is controlled. But for those who persist, the reward is access to the raw data of history, the unedited voice of the past. But do not neglect the ground. The archaeological reports from the post-fire restoration and other modern excavations are your second key. They reveal the physical truth that the paper record may seek to hide. Stone and soil do not lie in the same way that a court chronicler does. They show you the foundations of the abandoned Round Table, the scorch marks of forgotten fires, the brutal reality that lies beneath the manicured lawns. This investigation was not easy. It required piecing together fragments from forgotten chronicles, archaeological surveys, and tightly controlled archives, all to challenge a narrative that has been polished for a millennium. This is the work we do. We don't just tell stories, we excavate them, and this work is only possible with your support. If you believe in the importance of asking these hard questions, of looking past the gilded facade to find the hidden machinery of history, then join us. Like this video to signal that these deep dives matter. Subscribe and become part of a community dedicated to uncovering the truth. And most importantly, use the comments below to direct our next investigation. What institution, what dynasty, what forgotten structure holds a secret that needs to be brought into the light? Where should we point our lens next? The lessons of Windsor are clear. Power is a performance, beauty is a weapon, and the truth is always archived. Our job is to find the key. The investigation continues.